Hi, Frenzy. Welcome, me. Talking with those people. I woke up from a nap a little while ago, and Cobra Kai Never Die. Hi, Bacon. I guess you could say I'm a little bored, maybe. I don't know. Not exactly bored. I just got up from a nap. Rich is still sleeping. Uh, I would like to watch the new season of Cobra Kai, but it's not out yet. I just watched a video that talked about hints dropped in Twitter by the makers of Cobra Kai about what's going to happen in Cobra Kai season 3. So that was a little bit of satisfying my appetite for Cobra Kai, but not much. Supposedly it's going to come out, I think, April 20th or something. They haven't made a formal announcement, but they have said that the release of season 3 is not going to be delayed by the COVID thing. We're underthinkers now? Oh. I don't know what's up, Cloud. Hi, Tweak. You tweaking? Henlow Park. How am I in the quarantine? I mean, I'm handling the quarantine just fine, more or less. I didn't have a whole lot of, oh yeah, if, I mean, I would love to debate him on evolution or anybody else. The evolution debate's exciting thing to debate about because it's the sort of thing that I really go get juicy on, which is everybody's wrong. It's true. It's like I've got it right. Everybody's actually wrong about this, and I'm right about it. And whenever I try to talk to anybody about it, they're so convinced they're right, and then they have no answers for anything, and they don't know anything about, like, they don't have any good reasons to believe in evolution or even know what it is. It just runs afoul of all of our basic observations and stuff. Animals give birth to members of the same species, and that doesn't change what that is. What that is doesn't make sense. And what that is doesn't change. It doesn't make sense that it could. But Cloud, as you've indicated before, you have no idea what it is that you're in favor of. You say theory of evolution is a concept that makes the most sense, but you have no concept about what theory of evolution means. So you don't know what it is you think that the chances of it being correct are high. You have no idea. When I ask you, you have no idea. What do you think evolution is? Like, what's the mechanism behind it? Okay, well, so Bacon, what you're referring to there is the thing called the founder's effect. In order to get around the fact that evolution makes no mathematical sense except with extraordinarily small populations, and even then only through genetic drift of nearly neutral mutations, they created this notion called the founder's effect, where the reason species evolve is because they keep getting bottlenecked down to just a couple of members, and then those two members happen to be mutated in a certain way so that the species member they come up with is a new species all of a sudden. And that's why there aren't any intermediate species. Well, that's just patently absurd. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't explain anything at all. The idea that in order to become pigeons, there were a series of intermediate species, each of which got whittled down to two members, each of whom were uniquely mutated to survive the thing that killed everybody else. And that's how new speciation comes around. I mean, it's absolutely patently insane. It makes no sense at all. It violates everything we know about the world. So yeah, the evolutionists have come up with a series of weirdly complicated concentric circle explanations to keep the concept of evolution without retaining any of its precepts. It's weird. You came up with an example of chicken yesterday. Yeah, I know that's what evolution says it is, but that's not a process. That's a description of what happens. It doesn't explain how it happens at all. Evolution is not anything. What is it? What do you think happens? How is it that you think genomes change over time? That doesn't prove anything, Cloud. How is it? What is it that you believe in? How is it that the thing goes from meow to meow? What do you believe in? You have no idea. Do you believe in natural selection? It's all against change over time. It extinguishes deviation from the genetic norm. That's just fact. Nobody disagrees with that. Then, Cloud, if you haven't spent any time studying biology and you can't answer the question, what is the mechanism by which these things occur, then why in the world would you believe it? If any understanding of evolution that involves genetic change over time were correct, then obviously genomic diversity would increase with population size. But it doesn't. It makes absolutely no sense as a consequence. If you can't explain why the sky is blue, should you believe it is red? No. But you can easily explain why the sky is blue, because when you look at it, it appears blue. That's not the same thing with evolution at all. You're trying to explain how something came to be, not what it is. It's the thing is, we don't need to understand whether gravity is. Well, see, again, Cloud. There's a difference between talking about what is and talking about how something came to be. Okay? So, could I explain gravity? No. But I can demonstrate it by dropping something, right? Now, can you demonstrate evolution? No. In fact, when we try to demonstrate evolution, we discover that evolution is nonsense. When we try to demonstrate evolution, we breed dogs into separate breeds, make them as far apart from each other as possible can, and they still stay the same species. In fact, they can still breed with wolves. Yeah, sure, we could demonstrate it. We've tried. We've proved the opposite, that it's not demonstrable. That, in fact, that they stay the same species no matter what, no matter how hard we push the differentiation. I mean, the thing is, we've tested it directly, guys. We already have the test. It's cut and dry. It's easily determinate, right? We've pushed dogs as far as we possibly can in all directions, and they still haven't changed species. And if we were to let them all run around in the wild, they'd all return to a mean. In other words, the dog species genome would return to its mean over time, and these differentiations would wash out. Okay, that's the facts. So we have no reason to believe evolution at all. None. The only reason that's really provided that makes any sense at all is easily demonstrated to be ridiculous by the archaeological record. Yes, the fossil record would seem to suggest increasing complexity over time. So would the archaeological record, but we don't conclude that buildings evolved from simpler forms into more complicated forms. We just don't, because we're sensible in that fashion. All right, now if you want to talk about viruses, quote unquote, evolving, first of all, viruses don't sexually reproduce. So what's the mechanism by which they're evolving? And what can we learn from that? I mean, I've heard this argument before. I've heard all of these arguments before. None of them have any water. Watch David Berlinski. Watch the David Berlinski video. Okay, this guy is smart and he knows what he's talking about. If you don't like to believe me, and a lot of people are like, well, Eric can't possibly have figured this out. He can't be the one who's right about it. It's not just me. Okay, it's not just me. And smart people.
It's not even clear that science is progressing. It might be moving in a circular pattern. Ever.
So, if you want to inform yourself about this topic, watch that video. I think that if Homo habilis was able to breed with Homo sapiens, then it was the same species. That's our definition of species. It's the only definition of species we have that's meaningful. The point is, though, Skygear, we already have eliminated as a possibility interbreeding between related species as the thing responsible for speciation. We've eliminated that as a possibility with lagers and with mules. Okay, but change within a species actually is adaptive to environmental pressures. So, do you get the problem here? We have seen change within a species, and it's always responsive to environmental pressures. Like, for example, the moths that turned black instead of white when they stood on the tree. For example, dogs. So that's just, it's not meaningful. Adaptation within a genome, within a species, over time, that doesn't change the species, but instead expresses the elasticity of the genome. Things like dogs and those moths that I mentioned. Well, that's not evolution of change within the species because, in fact, they revert back to the mean when those environmental pressures are reduced. So it's not evolution at all. It's just an expression of species, a species' genomic plasticity. Is it true that there's genomic plasticity within a species to environmental pressures? Yes. And is it reasonable to conclude, hey, this maybe that's how speciation occurred? Sure, it's an intuitively reasonable thing to jump, an intuitively reasonable conclusion to jump to. But that doesn't make it right. And when you actually look into it, it's completely nonsense. It makes no sense at all. Nobody has been able to explain it to me at all. People want to debate me about evolution. They begin always with the wrong notion that somehow I need to disprove evolution. Evolution as a theory that they can understand that explains something. They think of it as a team you're on. You're on either team evolution or team religion. But that's not the case at all. That's ridiculous. And it is a theory. And if it doesn't make any sense, then we shouldn't ascribe to it. And that's just common sense, you know? I mean, the critical thing to recognize, and this is something that people don't really understand at all, is that the word species is a metaphor. A species can't evolve. Species refers to a bunch of individuals with the same genomic identity. And only individuals can express anything. Species don't exist meaningfully. They're a quick set name that we use to describe individuals of the same genomic identity. Now, each of those individuals with the same genomic identity will only mate with another individual with the same genomic identity and produce children of the same genomic identity. So, in other words, it doesn't actually make any sense to consider a species as something that would evolve because the genome of that species is always represented by two individuals that always produce offspring with the same genome. So it makes conceptually no sense. But for Von Chase, here's the thing. That's not the case because if it were, okay, first of all, let's say the part of the genome, if any part of the genome can change, then the part of genome responsible for speciation can change. Well, that's like saying, well, if you really have brain plasticity, then you can use that to grow wings. No, just because there's plasticity within something doesn't mean it can do absolutely anything in the world. It can't change fundamentally what it is. It can only express what it is differently according to different pressures. But even if you were right, Von Chase, in theory, that any part of the genome responsible if the genome can change at all, then the part responsible for speciation could change. You'd have to tell me what that part was and what the mechanism of change over time is in the species genome. I can explain to you the mechanism of the change over time in the adaptive range of plasticity within the genome. We can see that in plenty of species that we've bred. Okay, so there's no disputing that there's plasticity within species genome. We've also proved that we can't exploit that plasticity to break out of the single species thing. We've pushed it as far as we possibly can in any direction. So you explain to me what is the mechanism by which that occurs, by which individuals who definitionally always mate with another member of their own genetic identity and always produce offspring with the same genetic identity, how it is that genetic identity itself changes over time due to adaptive pressures or something like that. Nobody has explained it at all. Nobody's explained it at all. If you were right, as I've said many times before, nobody disputed this or had any answer for it. If you are right about your basic concept, then genetic diversity increases with population size for a species. But it does not. So your basic concept is wrong. A species that has 1 trillion individuals in it, if any of the mechanisms of evolution made any sense, that would have a much more diverse genome than a species with 10 individuals in it. California condors, almost extinct. Same genetic diversity in that species as in ants. Countless trillions of them. Okay, but note, Cloud, flying squirrels remain flying squirrels who glide. We've never encountered any flying squirrels who gave birth to the next stage of flying squirrel. In a trillion trials we've had this, infinitely trillion trials, we've never encountered two members of a species give birth to anything but another member of that species. And remember, any of the mechanisms of evolution that purportedly cause change over time, they're subject to the genetic drift barrier because there's not any advantage to any mutations. Okay, nobody in the scientific community argues for a mutation-based evolution any longer. We have two theories to account for the fact that mutations cannot be responsible, okay? We have the nearly neutral theory, and we have the neutral theory. The nearly neutral theory is generally embraced as explanatory of some change in a genome, provided that the population is under 100. So that's where the founder's effects came into play. Oh, well, what we'll pretend is that every time there's an evolutionary change, that species bottlenecks down to two individual members, that both those two individual members happen to have had advantageous or nearly neutral mutations that change their genome in some way that is sustainable, even though we know for a fact that all mutations are deleterious and only some are barely nearly neutral. In other words, all mutations are deleterious. Did you hear me? Why would that mean any deviation from the genetic norm is deleterious? So obviously that doesn't change over time through that way. I mean, it's you have to be completely insane to think this means anything. Nobody's explained it. You explained it, Bon Chase. Explain what the mechanism is. What's the mechanism of change over time? Is it mutation? Is that what your claim is? It's not. You're wrong. I can point you to countless scientific articles that have dispatched that notion long ago. Okay, you're saying evolution is possible. Evolution claims to explain where speciation came from. So tell me what that explanation is. Evolution is not something that's possible. It claims to explain things. So tell me the explanation, please. What is evolution? How does it happen? Why is there any reason to affirm this position? Is there? Well, actually, Bon Chase is making new arguments that I haven't really heard before. Like, he's trying to muddy the claim. Hey, there's no reason to disbelieve evolution. It's possible. Dude, evolution doesn't exist except as an explanation for something. So to say you believe it means is it a good explanation or a bad explanation? It's trying to explain how shit came to be the way it is. It's not describing the way things are. It's explaining. Like, we can conclude about a tree, for example, that the way it got the way it is that it started very small and grew very large. We can apply that concept to species, but there's no reason to believe that's the case. We could also conclude that the way that boulder right there got so large is that it started very small and then it grew bigger and bigger and bigger over time. It's only true for one of those things. The tree, not the boulder. You know, you don't mean anything when you say species evolved. Remember, species is a metaphor. Individuals have genome. Individuals have a genome, and that genome represents a species. In other words, all the individuals the same genome are the same species. That when you say it's maybe that species evolved uniformly, what do you mean by that? What does that mean? How do they change? What's the mechanism by which they change? Nobody has any explanation for me. I mean, look, the evolutionists are always grasping at straws. They're trying to find some freakish, atypical instance of something that seems to support this notion and jumps on it like all crazy while ignoring all the evidence that contradicts it. My favorite rap beef of all time? Eminem versus Benzino. Benzio. We can observe those things. Look, people keep making analogies with things we can observe. We've never observed anything like evolution. We've always observed the opposite. I'm saying there's plasticity within a species. In other words, we have examples of dogs that were bred to be successful in cold weather with more fur on them, and dogs that are bred to be lap dogs like Chihuahuas, and that it's possible to isolate populations and change the expression of that species within the limits of genetic plasticity. Just like it's possible to make my muscles bigger by working out, it's not possible to change them into dorsal fins, because there's a difference between various expressions of an identity and transition to a different identity. Well, that's fine. I mean, that's true. Obviously, the definition is not purposed for that sort of calculation. It's purposed to determine whether something that would appear to be a new species is in fact a new species that can perpetuate itself. And it's not, because they never, even if you make multiple members of that new species, it can't reproduce. I think she's feeling better. She and I both were napping. We're having a little bit of a. We're not fully resolved yet or anything, because what I'm really looking to hear about all that stuff from Rachel is basically, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I regret that. I don't want to break up. Please forgive me. That won't happen again. If I can stop myself from doing it. Just sort of that basic message is what I'm kind of looking for from her, to show me that we're on the same page, that we're looking at relationships in the same way, that in fact, that she's not disagreeing with me anymore about what's required of a partner. And I'm not quite getting that from her. I'm not getting that sort of, I'm so sorry, please forgive me, take me back, I was totally wrong, you're totally right, kind of response from her at all. So, my take on that is, I said that to her before I went and took a nap. I said, listen, this is the problem here. She called her dad, and I didn't like the way that conversation with her dad went down. It was all like, well, we'll see what happens. And, but when we just finished talking about how that's not an acceptable frame, I mean, the claim of evolution is that species, I mean, it's even hard to articulate what it is, right? It's like that adaptability quality, that plasticity of genome that we can see expressed in dogs and such, that's responsible. That same mechanism is responsible for speciation, but it occurs naturally. That it occurs based on selecting something that gives you an advantage, or at least not a disadvantage, or But I mean, the thing is, the scientists have muddled and dissembled on this thing so much that it's hard to know what they're arguing anymore. So it's hard to negate it. That's why I keep going back to the point that evolution is the thing that claims it has an explanation, but its explanation makes no sense at all. It's not an explanation for anything. So nobody should believe it. Right. Well, one of the ways that the evolutionary science has attempted to preserve the notion of evolution while also preserving some sort of scientific integrity is they've eliminated the definition for the word species. There is no definition anymore because any definition that we make disproves evolution, basically. So they've gotten rid of all definitions of species. So again, how do you explain then the different species? Or what, are you explaining different what? You're explaining you don't use that word anymore? What? No, we use it, we just don't define it. Holy moly, you are really determined not to wake up and smell the coffee here. Well, sure, people have a definition for evolution. Evolutionary scientists don't have a definition for evolution. They don't have a definition for species. That's the common parlance definition for species, is when they can make a reproductively viable offspring of the same species. Of course, to be a reproductively viable offspring, it also has to be the same species. Definitionally, it makes no sense that two members of a species could give birth to something that's not a member of that species. I wouldn't say it's an analogy, I'd say it's a metaphor. Okay, so what you're saying is the definition of species doesn't include genomic similarity. Okay, fine. By using the definition of species you have right there to draw set lines around species, we determine that within those set lines there's a genomic similarity. So that's an additional piece of information we have. Whether you want to include that as part of the definition of species or not doesn't make any difference to me. It's nevertheless an additional piece of information about species. Okay, so Cloud, how does that 0.00001% change the genome of the whole species? Let's say it's the one that you give birth to, this 0.00001% different, is one member of a million individuals of a species. So how does that one member change the genome and cause speciation to occur? Because remember, all the other members of the species are giving birth to things that are exactly the same. I mean, so I don't understand why the how or why the occasional mutation that's not so deleterious as to kill the thing, but instead nearly neutral, how that enters the genome and takes over and causes a change in genomic identity. That individual doesn't have any massive reproductive advantage, even if it had some reproductive advantage. It's not a random mutation that happens. Okay, so what's the mechanism by which this non-random mutation is responsive to need? Yeah, exactly, Bacon. Well, see, that's again mistaking elasticity of the individual for elasticity of the special genome. It's like, look, no, that's Cloud is arguing Lamarckian evolution right now. And in fact, Lamarckian evolution makes more sense than Darwinian evolution, because Lamarck at least said right out the gate, there's obviously a need for an increase in complexity both up and down and side to side, so to speak, and we can't explain the up and down one. And he was right. Mark was right. We can't explain the up and down one. But he can explain the side to side one, sort of. You gotta look into Lamarck. He's cool. He's kind of my hero now that I've realized evolution is bullshit. Why, I do declare it's Mr. Ann Davenport. How do you do, madam? I'm saying that environmental pressure doesn't produce speciation. We've tested it maximally, way more than nature could ever test it, with dogs. There's no possible imaginable scenario in the natural world that puts as much pressure on a species to change as intentionally breeding could, that for thousands of years does. And yet, despite doing that, we still can't change them into a different species, despite pressing the elasticity angle as hard as it could possibly ever conceivably be pressed. Much more hard than it would ever naturally be pressed in the natural world. There are no environmental pressures that even come close to the willful breeding of people. I mean, of dogs, not people. Listen, I'm not trying to start a bunch of evolution talk. People are very fussy about this point. People are married to the concept of evolution as explaining everything. They're like, but we do know where species come from. And I'm like, no, you don't. You have no fucking clue. The thing you say you believe in, you don't even know what it is. It's ridiculous. It's the same thing as God. If you ask people like to define God and stuff, well, okay, so how exactly is this God thing responsible for speciation? They don't have any answer either. So it's the same fucking thing. It's the same total lack of response. The same total lack of sense making. At least with the God thing, you can say, no, I don't have any good explanation. All I have are magical explanations. If you're smart, that's what you'll say. And I don't need to defend this because it's a magical explanation. It's not a real explanation. And people should say in response to that, oh, sounds like you got it right. We don't until in the absence of a better explanation, might as well go with the magical one. At least it inherently doesn't fail to meet its own burden. The problem with evolution is it's trying to claim legitimacy on scientific grounds, but it's just making magical thinking arguments. Hey, L overthrows. I may yet still one day be proved wrong by somebody who actually can explain evolution to me or anybody else. But until that day arrives, believe me, I'm not talking on my ass, even if I'm proved wrong. I am very knowledgeable about evolution and all of the scientific claims about it. And I am not unresearched on this matter. I'm more researched than anybody I ever talked to about it, that's for sure, including a lot of people who took evolutionary science in college as their major. I've done a lot of research. I'm a debate coach. My job is to be able to quickly research things and glean from them all the pertinent argumentational vectors and determine whether or not they're sound. You know? I mean, I have to be able to win. I can't. If you're going to catch me by surprise by going, well, what about this thing? And I don't know about it. Well, then that's going to be embarrassing. It's happened. I've learned about the thing thereafter. Plants are too, sure. We can't breed one plant into another plant. Someone brought it up. Is Charles Darwin wrong on all fronts? Well, I mean, I don't think he was wrong about everything he ever said in his life. I'm sure he was right that time he said, I think I'm coming down with a cold. Rachel and I appear to be more or less fine and getting better. Well, the debate is to whether or not we have in our presence already an explanation for speciation. People claim that we do, but we don't. And that bothers me. It bothers me that a lot of people claim that they have an explanation for where species came from, but they can't explain it to me. What their purported explanation is, they're completely unable to explain it to me. It's like, that's the thing that's offensive. If you're going to claim there's an explanation here, then be able to explain it to me. It's like people keep wanting to negate evolution. I would be happy to negate it, except it won't explain what it is to me. Now, I'm not necessarily going to negate that one, El Lobo Froze. It is quite plausible that one day El Lobo Froze took a huge dump, and that's where everybody came from. What do I think the underlying theory for, what's my underlying theory for the cause of people being attached to evolution? Let me pull this bong rip and then I'll I'll tell you. I'm going to transubstantiate this bong rip to psychological. I transubstantiate thee. Oh, the bell ringer. That's a good one. That was a good one. Cloud. I guess I'm emotionally invested in it. Right. That's the thing is, I guess in some way it's probably kind of dumb at this phase maybe, but I've been refining my shtick, right? I certainly can be very intelligible, such as I'm a very articulate speaker, so anytime I'm arguing anything, people go, okay, well, he sounds smart. But most importantly, for the people who themselves are very knowledgeable, I always hear at the end of it, okay, you really know what you're talking about. And the reason is because I don't debate things that I don't prep. It didn't take a lot of time for me to prep. I just need to read some things. And I naturally hone in on what the key argumentational vectors are because I've been coaching debate for a long time. Let's see, and that's okay. So that's one of the key things I want to mention here in Ian Davenport is the problem. The reason people defend evolution is because of that frame right there. People frame evolution as the alternative to creationism, but remember, creationism and evolution are the same thing. They're both making claims that they have an explanation. But we can't live in a world of false dichotomy. It's like it could be neither explanation is an explanation. And it is the case that neither explanation is an explanation. They're both just claims without any guts in them. Like if I were to say, oh, well, creationism. So, but how did that creation occur? There's no explanation. Evolution. Well, but how did that evolution occur? There's no explanation. Yes. Right, and that's all you're going to find out there. Everybody frames it as evolution versus creationism, but I'm not making any counter advocacy here. I'm just saying, oh great, you have an explanation? Please explain it to me. Nah. Oh, okay, look. We can look at physics is great because it gives us an example of how we test theories. So, for example, we have Einstein's theory of relativity. It makes a bunch of predictions that it takes decades to either falsify or verify, and it's verified consistently. And the predictions are proved to be, yep, it made this prediction, and then we in fact discovered that when we did that test. Nothing like that has ever happened with evolution. All of its predictions have been falsified. And yet, it doesn't matter. People just still cling to it anyway. And they just make it more and more complicated without any actual explanation. It's a more and more complicated description of the problems with the explanation. So what is punctuated equilibrium? Punctuated equilibrium is not an explanation for anything. It's a description of something that invalidates the concept of evolution. The fact that the species didn't all come slowly over 4 billion years, but that they all burst into existence out of nowhere in about 2 million years. So that's what we have to accept because the concrete data is very clear about that. The fossil record is very clear about that. So naturally, if your theory is speciation is changed very slowly over 4 billion years, and you discover, oh shit, all the species showed up in 2 million years, then you scrap your theory, right? You scrap it. You go, we were wrong. No, they go, oh no, we were right. It's just punctuated equilibrium for a very short period of time. Evolution goes very, very fast. And then after that, it enters a period of stasis where it really doesn't happen at all. Okay, so why does that happen? How does that happen? What's the mechanism by which that happens? No explanation. None. Should we believe in a higher entity then, like God? I mean, that's not my explanation. I'm not making that advocacy. I'm asking evolution if it explains things or not, and it clearly does not. There's no explanation there. It's a bunch of smoke and mirrors. Like this kind of shit. What Bonche says, well, maybe genomes were easily mutated before, and now there isn't because the environmental pressure to make sure mutations don't occur since the majority of mutations are bad. Okay, but why were they easily mutated before and not now? I mean, sure, you want to look at, just go on to Wikipedia, type in nearly neutral theory, type in punctuated equilibrium, type in neutral theory, type in genetic drift, and open up those pages and read the shit. That's what I did. And if you want to, you can link to the papers themselves at the bottom. What you'll see, though, is they're making a bunch of explanations and they're disproving the central thesis. When they explain anything in particular, they're using scientific rigor, but they're just not applying the conclusions that they ought to the overall theory, Okay, so that's not an explanation. That's just let's pretend. Let's pretend that genes were fundamentally different than they are now. And that's why. Okay. Well, why should we believe that instead of something else? Well, you have no reason for it to believe that or something else. What's another very commonly held political decision you don't believe? McDonald's is unhealthy. I don't believe that. Do atoms exist? I don't really have any opinion on that. Yeah, I'm not making any counter advocacy. I was excited to hear that evolution explained where species came from, and then when I asked it, I discovered it didn't make any explanation. It's not a theory even. It's a collection of anecdotes, as David Berlinski says. No, mutations exist, but they don't explain change over time because they're all deleterious. The best you get is nearly neutral. There are no positive mutations. And McDonald's is one of the healthiest things you can eat. If you live just on McDonald's all the time, you're doing great. So, when people say you need to eat healthy, that means you should eat more McDonald's. Remember, the pressures only impact individuals. So ask again what you're thinking. Some individual was mutated, remember? An individual was born with some mutation. Okay, so now remember that, first of all. And the healthier a population gets, the less mutations affect the gene pool. But you see, the thing is, implicit right now is something we all agree on. There is negative selection. That is to say, if you were born with a mutation, your chances are you're going to die. And the worst case scenario is, or best case, depending on how you look at it, is there's a individual of a species born with a mutation that's not so deleterious that it kills them. It's just nearly neutral. And in those instances, that individual can live and introduce that sickening element into the genome, which can spread across the genome at some point. Of course, note, there's no reason to think it's going to take over the genome or that it's going to cause an evolution at all. In fact, it just means that probably that genome that begins as robust and repeats itself over and over again. Remember, it's self-replicating. This is the idea of a species, is that it's self-replicating. And that it always makes more members of the same species. So that over billions and billions of years, those genomes will get weaker as they collect nearly neutral mutations within them, each of which has no fundamental change in the species except to make the genome have things in there that would have been extinguished, but were weak enough problems that they were able to sneak in to the genome. So I would suspect that in billions and trillions of years, every genomic line will become tired, spent, and sort of filled with viruses and sickly members and stuff. Because of this nearly neutral thing. But believe me, there's nothing that evolution's established that supports the idea of changing genomes of species over time. It all contradicts it. So, remember, Cloud, gravity is not an explanation of how things came to be the way they are. Okay? It's an explanation for why shit falls when you drop it. We call that force gravity. It explains why things fall down. Do I understand the explanation? No. But I don't dispute that things fall down. Evolution explains where different species come from. Do I dispute that there are different species? No. But it can't demonstrate that things fall down. You see? It's begging the question. Evolution is an explanation for how things came to be the way they are. It is not a description of the way things are. So to be a good explanation for how things came to be the way they are, it's talking about a process, and it's presenting a process that purportedly is ongoing and that produces effects to species genomes. But all of the predictions we would make from that are falsify the notion. Namely, if in fact that were the case, genetic diversity would increase with species size. That's not the case. So falsification 1 right there. If it were the case, we'd see some members of the species sometimes give birth to something other than a member of their species. Not the case. Falsification 2. Okay, but Cloud, remember, we can test it because different species have different length of lifespan and different numbers of generations. So the important thing, Cloud, to remember is that let's say it takes 10 million years, like you said, 10 million years, okay? Let's say it takes 10 million years. Some things have a lifespan of 1,000 years, like a tree. And some things have a lifespan of like a day, like a fruit fly. So the number of generations differs for different species. 10 million years is a lot of time for fruit flies, not very much time for 1,000-year-old trees. 10 million years is only 10,000 generations for 1,000-year-old trees. So how does it evolve from a little piece of grass down on the ground to a massive sequoia in 10,000 generations? How does it do that? Each of which is born of the same species. Remember? It's not throwing out random babies of random different kinds of plants. Why do people statistically grow taller with time? I mean, flexibility within the genome, one way or the other. It could be better nutrition. I mean, if you were to ask evolution that question, the answer would be taller people have more babies. Is that the case? Right? So let's say it is the case that people grow taller over time. Is it because of evolution? Well, if it is because of evolution, I mean, first of all, this wouldn't be evolution. It would be the adaptive quality, right? The adaptive quality within a genome, the plastic quality within a genome is subject to selection. So, you know. The other thing is, biologists have attempted to make a genetic clock to measure, to give us some kind of understanding of quantification here, something to make it a little bit more rigorous. Like, this is how long it took to get from A to B. Can't do it. Nothing. There's nothing. If you ask any evolutionist, how long did it take to get from A to B? How many generations did it take? How many intermediate species were there? Because remember, there have to be intermediate species for all these things. Where are the intermediate species? All right, I'm done talking about evolution. You're right, though, Cloud, that it's true. Trees shoot off lots of like acorns or whatever, each of which can become another tree. But I still, there's no, I mean, so that doesn't note that they're all the same tree that they grow up, though. So how is it this occurs? But Cloud, remember, we're not talking about a tree evolving. We're talking about something that begins with a lifespan very short, evolving into something that has a very long lifespan, gradually changing from a grass into a sequoia. So, how many generations did it take to get there? Where are the intermediate species? You know, they don't stop being the tree they were before they made acorns. Why would there be biological processes that prevent excess mutation when there's a simpler organism? Because other mutations far outweigh the survival of the population. I don't understand that. What do you mean there? Are you saying that some mutations are actually good and help the species to survive? Help the individuals survive? Remember, species don't survive. We think about that. If you get extinction, the species has died or something. Species is a metaphor. Individuals survive and die and give birth to other individuals of the same species, definitionally. No, I mean, that's not true either. It's not true that individual is a metaphor. An individual is, in fact, a distinct entity in space and in time. It has an identity and it occupies space. It's distinct. When we use words to describe those things, those are not metaphors. Those are symbols, but not metaphors. So if I say, this is a lighter, there is nothing metaphoric about the word I'm using. It is describing something concrete and specific. When I say that's a species, like nothing I can point to that's a species. I always have to say that's a member of a species. The species only exists conceptually as and is defined as all the members that look the same, can mate with each other, and our normal definition of the species. So in other words, species is something to which each individual can lay claim, but that has no identity itself, except the commonality of all the individuals. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it can't change because it definitionally is the commonality of all the individual instances of that identity, that NI identity. Well, it's true that it's possible to take a word that's non-metaphorical and turn it metaphorical. In other words, every word exists as an instance, not as an object of analysis. It can be an object of analysis, but by and large, they exist as instances, not objects of analysis. Well, I mean, another thing, another popular belief that I don't agree with at all is that we should mitigate the effects of climate change rather than adapt to them. I'm much more in the adaptation camp that says we shouldn't be arbitrarily, at least not with carbon emissions, we shouldn't be limiting carbon emissions in order to deal with climate change. We should be adapting to the negative impacts of it. Okay, so what is your possible process why dogs aren't species? Let me go scroll up and see it. I don't see it. Can you copy and paste it again? What is that process, though? You didn't explain what it is. You just claimed that there is a process. You don't have any explanation as to what it is. That's not an explanation for anything. That's just speculating that something that there's no evidence for exists. I don't agree with I don't agree with Winter there. I think we could establish a process taking place over 100 million years, but I don't think that we have with evolution. Speaking of assholes, I gotta poop. I'm gonna actually wrap this one up. I may live stream again later. I want to go see how Rachel's doing, and I want to poop and beauty view.